New York is heading into 2026 looking familiar on the surface, but behind the scenes, things are quietly shifting in ways most people haven't fully processed yet. This isn't just another year for the state. Between policy changes, cultural shifts, enforcement updates, and major global attention landing right on its doorstep, New York in 2026 is shaping up to be a turning point. And whether you live there, plan to visit, or just follow what happens in big states because it usually spreads outward, what's happening in New York matters. The first thing people need to understand is that New York doesn't make changes loudly. It rarely announces things in a way that feels dramatic at first. Instead, the state tends to roll out adjustments slowly, letting residents adapt in real time while outsiders don't notice until the effects are already locked in. Going into 2026, that pattern is continuing, especially when it comes to how the state handles daily life, personal responsibility, and enforcement priorities. One of the biggest shifts people are feeling is how laws are being enforced rather than what the laws technically say. In New York, enforcement has become more situational, more discretionary, and in some cases more confusing. Two people can do the exact same thing in different counties and have completely different outcomes. As we move into 2026, that inconsistency isn't shrinking. It's becoming the norm. And that creates a quiet tension for residents who don't always know where the line actually is anymore. Housing is another pressure point that's impossible to ignore. New York has spent years trying to balance tenant protections with landlord rights, and going into 2026, the state is leaning even harder into regulation. Rent stabilization rules, eviction processes, and property requirements have become more complex, not simpler. For renters, this can feel like protection. For property owners, it often feels like walking through a legal maze where one mistake can cost thousands. The issue isn't just affordability anymore, it's predictability. And in 2026, predictability is still missing. Public behavior laws are also quietly changing in how they're applied. Things like noise complaints, public gatherings, loitering, and street-level enforcement aren't handled the same way they were even 5 years ago. New York has moved toward a complaint-driven model, which means enforcement often depends on who complains, where, and how frequently. This has created a strange reality where something can be ignored for months and then suddenly enforced aggressively with no warning. Going into 2026, this unpredictability is something residents are learning to live with. Transportation is another area where New Yorkers are noticing slow but meaningful change. Traffic enforcement, toll systems, congestion pricing discussions, and public transit rules are all evolving. In many parts of the state, automated enforcement has expanded, meaning tickets aren't always issued by an officer anymore, but by systems that don't care about intent or context. For drivers, especially those commuting into city centers, 2026 feels like a year where the margin for error keeps shrinking. Social services and eligibility rules are also being quietly adjusted. Programs that people have relied on for years are now operating under updated thresholds, verification requirements, and timelines. These changes aren't always announced clearly, and many residents don't realize they're affected until benefits are delayed or denied. The system hasn't necessarily become harsher, but it has become more procedural. And in 2026, paperwork matters more than ever. Workplace expectations are shifting too. New York continues to lead on worker protections, but with that comes new compliance requirements for businesses. Scheduling rules, wage transparency, classification standards, and leave policies are being enforced more tightly. For employees, this can feel empowering. For small business owners, it can feel overwhelming. Going into 2026, many employers are quietly adjusting operations not because they want to, but because the risk of penalties is simply too high. One thing people outside the state don't always realize is how much local governments matter in New York. Counties and cities have significant influence over how state rules are interpreted. That means two residents living just an hour apart can experience completely different realities. In 2026, this local variation isn't going away. It's becoming more pronounced, making it harder to generalize what New York law actually looks like in practice. Culturally, New York in 2026 feels divided but also deeply connected. The state remains a magnet for global attention, especially with international events, tourism, and media coverage increasing. But at the same time, Everyday residents are focused on very local concerns: cost of living, safety, education, and quality of life. This creates a strange split where New York is celebrated globally while debated constantly at home. Education policies are another area where subtle changes are having big effects. Curriculum standards, disciplinary approaches, and parental involvement rules have evolved significantly over the past few years. Going into 2026, schools are operating under guidelines that prioritize inclusion and flexibility, but that also leave administrators with more discretion. For parents, this can feel empowering or frustrating depending on how individual schools apply those standards. Public safety conversations haven't gone away either. They've just changed tone. Instead of dramatic announcements, New York has shifted toward quiet recalibration. Police presence, response strategies, and prosecution priorities vary widely by jurisdiction. In 2026, residents are less focused on headlines and more focused on what they personally experience day to day, and those experiences can be wildly different depending on where you live. Technology is playing a bigger role than ever in how New York operates. From licensing and permits to fines and records, more systems are digital, automated, and interconnected. This improves efficiency in theory, but it also means mistakes can cascade quickly. A missed notice or incorrect entry can snowball into a much bigger issue. Going into 2026, being proactive and organized isn't just helpful, it's necessary. Tourism is expected to surge, and with it comes increased scrutiny in major areas. Visitors often don't realize that New York's rules are stricter than many other states when it comes to things like alcohol consumption, public behavior, and short-term rentals. In 2026, enforcement in high-traffic areas is likely to be tighter, not looser, especially during major events. Short-term rentals deserve special attention because many people still misunderstand the rules. New York has made it clear that it wants to control how residential spaces are used, and going into 2026, enforcement around illegal rentals is expected to remain aggressive. Hosts who aren't compliant risk fines that can escalate quickly, and visitors may find last-minute cancellations more common as platforms crack down. Another under-the-radar shift is how New York approaches environmental compliance. Waste disposal rules, recycling requirements, and emission standards are being enforced more consistently. For residents, this can mean new bins, new schedules, and new fines. For businesses, it can mean audits and inspections that didn't happen before. In 2026, environmental rules are no longer symbolic. They're operational. Healthcare access and insurance rules are also evolving. While coverage options remain broad, eligibility and provider networks continue to shift. Residents are learning that staying informed is critical, because assumptions made even a year ago may no longer hold true. In 2026, healthcare in New York is less about access alone and more about navigation. One thing that hasn't changed is New York's influence. What happens here often becomes a blueprint elsewhere. Policies tested in New York tend to spread, whether people agree with them or not. That's why paying attention to what's happening going into 2026 isn't just relevant for locals. It's relevant nationally. For longtime residents, 2026 feels like a year where adaptability matters more than loyalty to how things used to be. The systems are still functional, but they reward people who stay informed and penalize those who assume things haven't changed. For newcomers, the learning curve is steep, but manageable if you understand that New York operates on layers: state, city, and local, all at once. The biggest mistake people make is assuming enforcement will be obvious. In New York, consequences often arrive quietly, through mail notices, digital alerts, or delayed responses. By the time something becomes urgent, options may already be limited. Going into 2026, awareness is the real advantage. So whether you see New York as a model, a warning, or simply a place that never stops evolving, one thing is clear. 2026 isn't just another year. It's a continuation of long-term shifts that are now impossible to ignore. The rules haven't all changed on paper, but the reality of living under them has. If you live in New York, stay informed. If you're visiting, don't assume the rules are flexible. And if you're watching from elsewhere, understand this. What starts in New York rarely stays there.